organogenesis, during tissue regeneration, during wound healing, but unfortunately for us, it's also active during metastatization of epithelial tumors, carcinomas, this kind of thing. And I will show you that there is at least 2 reported alternative splicing events which involve 2 proto-oncogenes that control this phenomenon. And this work was started many years ago in my lab. I initiated it, but in the last years it was carried out by other people because in the meantime I became old and I retired. But I can still tell you about what was going on. It involved this receptor called RON. You might ask, what does RON mean? RON comes from the French receptor, receptor d'origine nantaise. What does it mean? They were discovered in Nantes. Okay, so it's a receptor. It's a tyrosine kinase receptor for macrophage stimulating protein MSB, and the member of the scatter factor receptor family. It's very complicated, but this receptor is heterodimer, made of 2 subunits, beta and alpha. The cross membrane subunit is beta. These are usual receptors, the tyrosine kinase. What does it do? When it binds certain ligands, like the macrophage stimulating proteins and scatter factors, it changes the cells. It makes the cells more mobile. The cells, especially epithelial cells, starts to move around, to migrate, to cross the barriers. The reason why I became interested in this receptor is because our colleagues at the Cancer Institute in Turin told us that this, a splicing isoform of this receptor was overexpressed in gastric tumors. Initially, then it was found overexpressed in many other tumors. And the splicing isoform that was overexpressed was this one. This gene has many isoforms, has many splicings, many alternative splicing. But the particular splicing isoform that was overexpressed was this one that they call delta-RON, and now we call it delta-RON for the rest of this talk. Okay? It has a deletion. There is a small exon 11, that codes for 49 amino acid only, which we skipped in this particular splicing. This small deletion, the deletion of this small exon is very important because what happens is that in this exon, there is the site of recognition of the protease that cleaves the precursor and produces the heterodimer. So in this isoform is not cleaved. So this delta-RON isoform is constitutively expressed, so it phosphorylates the downstream signal cascade, even in the absence of the ligand. So it's hyperactive, it doesn't need any ligand to operate. So this is the description of this particular isoform that is kind of worrying, to find it in tumors. It's deleted from 49 amino acids in the beta chain, extracellular domain, and originates from the skipping of exon 11. This exon is skipped. This isoform is constitutively active in the absence of ligand. It confers an invasive phenotype to the recipient cells. So you transform cells transiently. With this isoform, the cells become more invasive, and you can test it with an in vitro assay, a transwell assay, which the cell can migrate to a membrane, nitrocellulose membrane of certain pore size, and you can verify. And this isoform is overexpressed in the majority of colon and breast cancers. So this was the starting point. We did a lot of work to find out what happened, why in certain cells you produce this isoform. This isoform is very bad because by conferring these invasive properties to the cells, they cause the metastatization of tumors. So what causes the skipping of exon 11? We did a lot of work, several papers are written, and we found out that it's kind of odd. Usually what controls the inclusion or the exclusion of an exon is within the exon. In this case, we discovered that what controls the inclusion or exclusion of exon 11 is in the downstream, is in exon 12. The exon 12 has an enhancer of splicing. Professor Morale talked about this enhancer of splicing. In enhancer next to a silencer. But what is important is this enhancer of splicing that contains binding sites, very strong binding sites, for a protein, a splicing factor called SF2-ASF. You already heard about it. It's an SR protein. It's one of the members of the SR protein. They are splicing factor essential involved both in constitutive and alternative splicing. In particular, SF2-ASF is an essential protein. It is a proto-oncogene. When overexpressed in mouse, it causes tumors. Anyway, we discovered that what controls the skipping of exon 11 is the binding of SF2 to the enhancer. And of course, the binding of SF2 to the enhancer, besides causing the skipping of causes the epithelial to mesenchymal transition. This transition is a change in the cell shape, in the cell organization. So the epithelial cells are like cobblestone. They're bound to each other, very tightly bound. Mesenchymal cells are more like fibroblasts. They are elongated, sparsely, and so here they are. So this is their cells constructed with a clone expressing SF2-ASF. And as you can see, the shape of the cells change, and you have a rearrangement of actin filaments. And then there are several other markers of this transformation from, unfortunately, there is too much light here, you don't see anything. But anyway, there is a strong reduction of E-cadherin. E-cadherin is an adhesive at the junction of the cells. And a reorganization of beta-catenin, which is typical of this transition. The cadherin here is decreased. There is a switch. It should be vector here and ASF here. Anyway, and a migration, an increase of the capacity of these cells to migrate through a nitrocellulose membrane. So it's enough to increase the SF2 factor to induce this transition. Not much, twofold, threefold, that's what causes this transition. The transition is reversible. The process is called MET, the opposite process, from mesenchymal to epithelial. And this is like, during this transition, a lot of things happen. You have protein that increase in abundance, and cadherin, fibronectin, transcription factors, and so on. Protein that decrease in abundance, E-cadherin, so on. Protein that accumulates in the nucleus, that normally are in the cytoplasmic, move to the nucleus. And the properties are increased scattering of cells, allocation of cell shapes, and resistance to anoicosis, which is resistant to apoptosis. The cells are more, they don't die easily. So this is the process. Epithelial cells gradually are stationary, mesenchymal cells are motile and invasive. And this is a model, a cartoon that describes what happens in the carcinoma tumors, especially at the edge of the solid tumors. Some cells undergo this process, and they cross the fibronectin, the barrier that separates tissues, because they can move, and they can even, unfortunately, they can move into the bloodstream and create the metastasis in a faraway district. And once they have settled in another district, the process can be reversed, and the metastasis usually cells go back to the epithelial form before degenerating again. And so, the process is confined to the metastatizing front of the tumor, according to. We discovered that it's very simple to reproduce this phenomenon. It's enough to grow cells. These are colon carcinoma, cellular colon carcinoma cells. If you grow them, you can grow them at high density or a low density. At low density, we simply change the density of the cells. You switch, and you can see that at low density, the cells look more like mesenchymal cells, while at high density, some of the parameters are of those of epithelium. See, for example, here, beta-catenin. Here is in the cytoplasm. At low density, moves to the nucleus. And here are the other parameters that clearly indicate that simply growing cells at different density, you reproduce what's going on. And surprising, but not too much. Simply growing cells at different density, you change the splicing profile of the receptor. So at high density, you have full electron, so exon 11 is included. At low density, you have almost 90% exclusion, skipping of exon 11. And in parallel, you see an increase of SF2 ASF. So the density of the cells influences this particular alternative splicing pathway. And so we said, well, that's very strange, until the paper was published about 3 or 4 years ago, in which the paper says that also the splicing of SR genes, and particularly of SF2-ASF gene, is controlled in a funny way. Let's concentrate on this one. This is our protein, the protein that, when it's overexpressed, causes the skipping of exon 11 in the receptor. This protein has an intron in the 3' untranslated end. I say, well, who cares? It's untranslated. It doesn't make any difference. But if you splice this intron, you create a junction, exon-intron junction. And you know the story. When this junction is more than 50 or 60 nucleotides downstream from a very good stop codon, this stop codon becomes a premature one. And as you will hear tomorrow from Lynn McWatt, the DNA, the RNA, the transcript that contains a premature stop codon are degraded, are directed to a pathway of destruction. And this is true for all these SR proteins, these splicing factor regulators. Okay? So they were very interesting because it turns out that this very important splicing factor, this homeostatic level, is controlled by a splicing event in a non-transcribed 3' region. Well, who cares? Until people observe that the cell density, like it did for the wrong receptor splicing, cell density, which is a model of EMT-MET transition, also regulates the splicing, the alternative splicing of SF2-ASF. You see, at low cell density, you have mostly the full-length isoform, so you don't splice this intron. At high cell density, you switch. You produce the NMT plus isoform. And so at low cell density, you have more SF2-ASF, and high cell density, you have less. So the transition epithelial to mesenchyma affects in the same way. Years. But the more I realized how much material I could cover. As you're probably all aware, ribosomes are ancient, and they've been around since life began. Life began when ribosomes. In this case, bound to tRNA, amino acyl tRNA, and peptidyl tRNA, and they form a peptide bond, which is right here. And so that's a reaction we're going to talk about initially, because this is how, as my Gauss will tell us later, life began. So this reaction occurs in the ribosome on the larger subunit via 50S or 60S, and it occurs in an area which we have called for many years the peptidyl transferase region. The amino acid is not alone because of its work. It had a lot of rotation. It would be hard to find the other amino acids. So amino acids are actually attached to tRNA structures. tRNAs were actually proposed years before they were actually discovered in the laboratory by Francis Crick in 1957. It wasn't 8 years later before Robert Hauy had actually crystallized the tRNA, which you see here. tRNAs have two really reactive groups. One is the 3' hydroxyl of the CCA, where the amino acid is attached. The other is down at this other end of the molecule down here, where you have in this open loop that Dino talked about, which makes these bases successful. This is the anti-codon, which will base pair with the codon in the messenger RNA. So this is a molecule that really does the translation when we talk about protein synthesis being translation, because it links a amino acid sequence with a nucleotide sequence, reading the genetic code. It makes protein. Okay, the other point to understand when we're talking about tRNAs, ribosomes, and protein synthesis is that these tRNAs actually span the two subunits. So we have the amino acyl end of the tRNA into the 50S subunit, and we have the decoding of the anticodon on the messenger RNA here on the 30S subunit. Now, when the amino acid comes to the ribosome, it comes attached to a tRNA, but this is a reaction that is occurring at an incredibly rapid rate. And since there are 20 different amino acids, and the cell doesn't know which amino acid it's supposed to take, it's only supposed to determine that by complementary sequence of the anticodon. A lot of tRNAs will go into the A site on the 30S, and they're wrong. In fact, 19 out of 20 are wrong, or there are actually about 40 different tRNAs. So it's going on and off and on and off at a terrific rate. But that's the first reaction you want to have happen when the tRNA goes onto the ribosome. You want to determine that it's the correct tRNA and it base pairs with the codon. You want not to have the amino acid actually go into the P site or the A site on the larger subunit, because it's got to be proved first to make sure it's the right amino acid with the right codon. So the way the cell deals with this is to add a protein factor which you've heard about called EMTU. EMTU binds to the amino acyl part of the tRNA and protects it from actually interacting with the with the peptidyl transferase region. EMTU also has other functions, of course. It facilitates binding the synthetase and putting the amino acid on here. And EMTU also has an affinity for the 50S subunit and 60S subunit. So it's actually bringing the tRNA to the ribosome, but it's protecting it at the same time, protecting this until you're certain that you have the right tRNA. And then at that point, you can form the peptide bond. So if the base pairing is correct at the codon anticodon, a signal is sent from the 30S subunit to the 50S subunit saying, we're going to take this tRNA and we're going to add the amino acid at the 3' into the growing peptide. Okay, so here's where we have to make this transition, because now we're going to talk about an enormous amount of data that's been collected over the last 45 or so years about the structure and the function of the ribosome. And I'm going to have a transition point at the year 2000, because in the year 2000 we had the appearance of crystal structures of the ribosome, and all of a sudden we had this enormous amount of information, and now we could fit it into precise crystal structures. And until 2000, until we really had crystals, we were looking at the ribosome at a distance and from the outside. Here's what the ribosome looked like after the year 2000. And as you can see, it didn't really make things easier because it looks much more complex. And a lot of people like to stay with this structure for a while. Eventually we got used to dealing with this. This is the messenger RNA. This is the small subunit, the large subunit. You can notice the amino acids, the proteins are essentially on the periphery of the ribosome. They have globular parts in most cases sitting on the outside of the ribosome, and they have arms extending into the ribosome, in many cases into functional regions. These are the three different tRNAs. Messenger RNA is here. I'll show you later how it winds around the head of the smaller subunit. This is an extension called the L7L12, which is actually 4 proteins of the same amount. And they are on the left side. When the factors come in during translation, they seem to facilitate the motion. So a lot of the information, a remarkable amount of information that we collected, all of a sudden made beautiful sense. And the most incredible thing was, as we looked at these data, we realized that it all fit. All the genetic, all the biochemical, all the structural and functional data we had collected over 40 years fit into this structure. And I think that was one of the most exciting points that we had. Okay. Now, if you ever go to a ribosome meeting, you'll be surprised, because there are really two kinds of people in the world who work in ribosomes. Those who work on structure, and then you have another group sitting over here who work on function. Okay. They do talk to each other, but they have a different focus. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the structure folks did initially, and then I'll talk somewhat about function, and then we'll try to put some information from the crystal structure together so you can see how the ribosome is working with the crystal structure. Initially, the structure folks identified ribosomes by electron microscopy back in the 50s, and they could see these little particles mainly in eukaryotic cells, and they didn't know what they were, but they guessed they were involved in protein synthesis because they did bind radioactive amino acids. But as in all science, the progress made in studying the ribosome really depended on the development of new technology. And the next technique that came about was the application of ultracentrifuge, which has allowed us to isolate the different ribosomes and actually separate the subunits. And once we had them separated by the ultracentrifuge, then we could take them apart and we could look at the protein and the RNA components separately, either using further uses of ultracentrifugation or chromatography. chromatography. At that point, in about 1966, it was discovered that you could actually put RNA onto a gel and separate it. And so we had this nice analytical technique, chromatography, and ultracentrifuge can be both primitive and analytical. But what we could see with electrophoresis was resolution not only of intact RNAs, but we could see changes in the conformation that were reflected in the size of the structure. And so we could see different bands of RNA, which were the same molecule, but we got the hint, the understanding that the RNA was really much more complex than we had thought initially. There was a very good chemist who began to work on ribosomes. One of the early studies was if you had a ribosome and you know that there are this many proteins here, how are they related to each other? So some chemists would take bifunctional reagents, which would have two reactive groups, add it to the ribosome, and then cross-link it to the ribosomal proteins and isolate these dimers, and then you could chemically separate them just by adding a sulfhydryl compound and identify which proteins are next to each other. So this is one approach that was taken. Synthesis was important early on because they were able to synthesize not only the triplets that were making the code, but synthesizing messenger RNAs. And of course, Fred Sanger, who Jim actually worked with many years ago, who originally developed a technique for sequencing proteins and developed a technique for sequencing RNA, and then developed a technique for sequencing DNA. And they only gave him 2 Nobel Prizes, but it was fortunate there was nothing else to sequence. But sequencing became absolutely critical because at the same time, the sequencing was developing, computers were beginning to be used, and there were people who were looking at the sequences and looking for repetitions of structure from one ribosomal RNA to another. These are people like Carl Rose, Harry Dowler, and Robert Guttell, and they began to see sequences that were repeated in different ribosomal RNAs, and they were almost identical. In fact, they were identical in some regions. And these highly conserved sequences, of course, signified these are probably important sequences as far as function. And you see these in the peptidotransferase region, you see these in the coding region, and so forth. So they made an interesting story out of using computers and finding these sequence conservation. You can also play certain games and see changes. We'll talk about that in a minute. So these are the techniques that were being developed during this time until finally we got to the crystal structures with Adioneth that worked many years on trying to crystallize. She crystallized but had to resolve the structures. Tom Sykes came along and did some very nice work at Yale. And Venki Ramakrishnan really deserves credit for working out the functional association of what they found in the crystals. And Harry Dowler, who did not get the prize like the other three, is really the person who I consider the person who has done the most to contribute to our understanding of the ribosome over the years. Okay, you take the ribosome lecture without showing this kind of a slide. And this shows you bacterial ribosomes and eukaryotic ribosomes. So the first thing you notice, not that they're all green, but the fact that they actually look fairly much like each other. So the 60S is larger than the 50S, but they both have arms like this, and the 30S look pretty much the same. They both have a head, and they have shoulders, and the messenger RNA, of course, goes around the head. The composition is pretty much the same. You'll say, oh, but there's an extra RNA here in the eukaryotic sequence. If you look at the sequence of the 5.8S RNA, it looks very much like the sequence of the 5' end of the 23S RNA. So what it really is a break in the 23S, creating a new RNA there. So the sequences, there are highly conserved sequences in here, but there are differences as well. And as you can see, the ribosomal RNAs in eukaryotic cells are bigger, but that doesn't mean that they have a much different structure. They have pretty much the same basic structure, the same core structure, except that at the ends of all these hairpin loops, they have extensions, which are called extension sequences. And that's how they get bigger. They just extend the stem structures, and with a few new structures as well. And there are about 54 or 55 proteins here, and there are many more, close to 80 in the eukaryotic ribosome, depending on which one you're looking at. But again, highly conserved sequences are found at important functional sites. Well, this sort of summarizes what I was talking about. In fact, ribosomal proteins are basic. They bind with ionic interactions, generally recognizing the overall structure and less the sequence, although there are a few proteins that recognize particular regions of the ribosomal RNA. The proteins are usually in a 1:1 ratio with the RNA, and there are some themselves have L12, which is 4 copies. The proteins are added to the RNA in a sequence during assembly, which resembles the addition of the proteins in vitro reconstitution. You can actually take the RNA and the proteins and combine them under correct conditions with heat and reconstitute the ribosome. There's nothing magic. There are factors which facilitate the assembly, but you can do it with just the ribosome components itself. Ribosomal RNA is acidic, of course, and it is initially made in a much longer sequence and then cut into the pieces, themselves being precursors, which are subsequently cleaned out to the correct size. The RNA is modified both on the sugars and modified on the bases at a number of places, as are some proteins modified as well. The RNA secondary and tertiary structures are quite, well, they're really from one sequence to another, but they're flexible. So what I think you should remember as I go through all this information is that I'm telling you a lot of information about the structure, but think of the structure as flexible, because even though they have highly conserved sequences and they have tertiary structure, the ribosomal RNA is actually, I think, moving. And we're beginning to see more evidence of that sort of thing, especially if you check the structure at different temperatures. And I'll show you some evidence right at the end of that. Okay, so looking at the ribosomal RNA, there were a number of techniques that were used. One was we didn't know anything about the ribosome, so what we wanted to do was to see what parts of this long stretch of the RNA are base paired and what parts are not. Well, you can react the RNA with several different series of different compounds like Ketoxyl, DMS, CMCT, and some of these will react with single-stranded regions, and then you can identify the sites that were modified, because if you're trying to make an extension of a DNA that would, an oligo would base pair here and extend, it would stop at the modified site. And so that would tell you whether or not that was chemically reactive, meaning whether it was single-stranded or double-stranded. That's one approach. Another approach was to use nucleases that were specific for single-stranded, double-strand, and some of the older folks in the audience will remember pancreatic RNase and T1 and cobra venom nuclease, which had single and double-stranded regions. And then there was cross-linking that was done to link different regions of the RNA. And then there was Carl Rose who put this all together, and he looked at the data, and he began to see regions that looked like they were base paired. But his question was, is that GC really a GC when you have these two strands cut together or not? And so he looked for other sequences, for other RNAs at that particular site, and he saw that it could be an AU instead of a GC. That was evidence in support that it really did require a base pair extent structure at that point. So in the end, this is the picture we had. Okay, this is the crystallography, and we had this evidence accumulated from antibodies binding to ribosomal proteins, telling us these are the sites where the proteins are, and this is the cross-linking data confirming that what we saw here was also quite valid here. Got me some questions. Have I gone too fast? Are you still with me? Okay. Okay, so this is where we were. And this is the functional information we had. We knew the process of translation before the crystal structure appeared. here. What I'm going to do now, after we go through this slide, is to address the crystal structure data and how it relates to these three processes: decoding, peptide bond formation, and translocation. And all of that occurs during elongation. So once you have the message and you have a ribosome and it's moving along, you have the tRNA coming in, you form the peptide bond, and then you have to translate, locate along the message. Those are the three steps we will address in here. I think for the non-ribosome and non-translation folks, let me just give you a quick overview of translation. This is a process as the ribosomes move along the messenger RNA, but it really starts with the smaller subunit interacting with factors, protein factors that bring the messenger RNA and the initiator tRNA to the ribosome and form an initiation complex, which then can bring the 50S together to form a 70S, and then you're off and running right here. You keep going until you come to one of three stop codons. When you get there, then protein factors come in and they recognize the stop codon, and they trigger the peptidyl-transferase region to open up and allow the water molecule to come in and hydrolyze the peptide attached to the tRNA, and then you initiate the termination process. So these release factors cause that process to occur. Then you have to get rid of the release factors, and then you have to get rid of factors, get rid of the release factors, and so forth. So you have the release factors in your RF3, and then you have RF, and finally you dissociate everything back and you start over again. Okay, before I do move on to these three steps, so let me just tell you a few things about what we know about some of these that are quite interesting little take-home lessons. Initiation is not looks like this is gone. Initiation is not a gradual process without changes. Recently, there's a paper studying the effect of IF1 on the 30th subunit, and they noticed that one particular base in the decoding region of 1408 is protected when you add IF3, and then when tRNA comes in, it also blocks the binding of the 50th subunit, wherever the 50th is right here. And when you do bring in the correct tRNA into the ribosome, then they actually see a change in the reactivity of 1408, such that now the 50S combined and IF3 leaves. So we're beginning to see changes in the structure by this kind of reaction. FMET tRNA, what do we know about FMET? Well, someone asked me recently, what does FMET tRNA always go to the P site, and all the other tRNAs go to the A site? And the answer is, if you look at the structure of FMET tRNA, you'll see in the anticodon stem region, there are actually 3 GC base pairs. And in the arm to the right of the attachment to the rest of the tRNA, there is a G pair at that site that's characteristic of the FMET. And the other characteristic that's unique for the FMET is at the very top, where you have the 5 and 3' ends, they're always base paired in other tRNAs, but not base paired. The structure, as a result, is really quite different. And as a result, this tRNA that's involved in initiation is recognized by initiation factor 2, which is equivalent of TU. And it doesn't recognize, it will not bind with TU in the same way all the other tRNAs won't bind with IF2. So it's specific, and it takes it to the A site. I wanted to tell you a little about historically about the peptidyl-transferase region. People back remember, if you look at the past history of just about everyone who worked on ribosomes, at some time in their career, in the discussion section, one of the papers they said, we continue to look for the ribosomal protein that carries the peptidyl-transferase activity. Even people who are really hardcore ribosomal RNA people now, they all said at one time that they thought the peptidyl-transferase had to be a protein. And of course it turned out not to be protein, and Harry Nowler showed a few years ago that you could take the ribosome and you could treat it with protease, and it still had peptide bond formation activity. So the ribosome is a ribozyme, which was confirmed by crystal structure data. You'll see in a minute. But we all went through the stage where we all believe the same thing. Okay, hybrid ribosomes, we'll talk about that. The fact that early on when Watson and Crick focused, well, actually it was Watson who wrote a really nice review on protein synthesis. The tRNAs would go to the A site, move to the P site, move to the E site. Well, it wasn't the E site originally, but they just moved like this. And it was later shown that ribosomes come in here, but actually they go like this as they move from the A site to the P site and so forth. And these are called hybrids. Hybrid also reminds me that we did an experiment a few years ago where we took E. coli ribosomes and we took Thermus Demophilus ribosomes, which are a bacteria, and but they evolved and they separated from each other a couple hundred million years ago. And we mixed the 30S from coli with the 50S from Thermus and vice versa, and then did an in vitro translation assay to see if they would work with each other, and they did. The only thing that was a little different was where they initiated, or we couldn't tell whether it was initiation or termination. But the reason I'm telling you that is that the structure, after all of these millions of years going on separate ways, was still sufficiently intact that they could actually combine and make protein. Termination, the other point to make on termination, I'm telling you all these things because these are all things we've wrestled with over the years. I think the hardest thing for a lot of people, myself included, in understanding termination was that we were so fixed on initiation involving base pairing between RNAs that we thought termination would be the same. And so we were all looking for sequences where RNA would match RNA and cause termination. It turns out termination involves proteins that recognize termination sequences, these release factors that are shown down here. Release factors recognizing UGA, UAG, or UAA termination codons. And then finally, the assembly. Some beautiful work on ribosomes was done early on by Masayasu Nomura, who recently passed away, and he was able to reconstitute these ribosomes, taking some of the mystique out of these, and allowing us to look at ribosomes as structures that actually we thought we could then understand, because there really wasn't any magic. We could take them apart, we could remove a protein, we could see what the effect on function was, and so forth. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some crystal structure data and just show you where things are relative to one another. So these are crystal structures of the 30S and the 50S, and what I've done is I've taken the ribosome, these are the two subunits, and I've opened them up like that. So you're looking at the interface side, and the interface is where the tRNA fits. The tRNA, remember, is spanning between the two subunits, and here's where the A, P, and the E site tRNAs are on the 30S subunit, and this, of course, the messenger would be right behind them, and the anticodon parts of the tRNA would be base paired to the messenger right here. These two CCA ends of the two tRNAs in the E and P site are not actually touching the 30S subunit, but they're reaching over into the 50S and right into this region right here. So you have to think of these as coming out at you in this structure. Okay, here's a picture of the RNA itself, 16S RNA, with in the secondary structure of 16S as we knew it before the crystals, and then you can take this and you can fold it into the shape you have in the ribosome. Now, the striking thing is you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 major domains, and if you look at the way they fold into the ribosome, you see 1, 2, 3, 4 major domains, and they're separate from each other. They're separate, sufficiently separate that you say, hey, maybe there's some kind of flexibility, and if there's flexibility, where's the site of rotation? And you can see the center for these 4 domains is right in here, and this is a structure called the pseudoknot, and it's a loop, and the top of the loop actually goes to another stem, creating a structure that crystallographically looks like a knot. It's not really a knot, but here's the pseudoknot, and this is sort of the center of these 4. And you can see the structures here. They're all identified with the head and the beak and the shoulder platform and so forth. Okay, but now if you look at the 23S, it's actually quite different. Okay, there are 6 domains, this one being the domain where peptidyl-transferase occurs, and the beauty of this is once you look at this, you say, how did they ever put that together? Look at how interwoven the RNAs are from each of these different domains. It's almost like it turns into a blue-gray color because you mixed all of these together. It's totally different than what you saw on the 16S. And if you see the separation here, and then you see the way this is fixed, this makes sense with the understanding that there's probably a lot more movement in the 30S, which is maybe more involved in moving the message in the tRNA through the ribosome than you see with the 50S. Once again, this is where the peptidyl-transferase region is. Any questions on this? Okay, and then this is just showing you again the structure of the 2 subunits separated, and you see the tRNAs right here is the peptidyl-transferase region, and these 2 have come together. Here they are separated. They're decoding over here. This is L712. Again, you can see somewhat from this picture also that the structure of the RNA is highly folded, and the proteins are centered more on the outside, but they do have these long strands that will go into the ribosome as well in many cases. Okay, so now let's talk about those 3 functions I wanted to address as far as decoding and peptide formation and translocation. And the one that takes the most time is decoding, and we'll spend a few slides on this. You always want to put the right tRNA with the right codon, and that's the right tRNA is called the cognate sequence. So if you have UUU and you somehow these got moved over, AAG, that is perfectly acceptable. The GU at the end is a mismatch, but that's a wobble base, and you can have wobble at the 3rd base. But the AU here is the correct codon, so that's cognate. The CCA with the UGA would have one mismatch in this case, the 1st base. You could have a mismatch in the 2nd base. Those are called near cognate. Those are not acceptable to the ribosome. The ribosome has a very finely tuned process of separating cognate and near cognate, and certainly the non-cognate are not accepted. I mean, here's where we have mismatches in both the 1st and the 2nd bases. So the ribosome is trying to only take the cognate tRNA. And of course, you know that there are 3 codons and 4 different bases. 4 times 4 times 4 is 64 different options. You have 3 stop codons, so you're left with 61 codons for 20 amino acids. You have about 41 tRNAs in bacteria. And so you do have many cases where you have a wobble base that accounts for the fact that you can have all 4 codons. You can have up to 4 or so with each amino acid. There are the only 2 amino acids that have a single codon, that's tryptophan and methionine. Okay, so how does the ribosome select the right tRNA? Before we had the crystal structure data really coming out, Jody Puglisi actually synthesized a fragment of the 3' end of 16S RNA, and looks like this is going. I can come over and show you. These 2A residues were in this right here, and those 2A's turned out to be absolutely critical to the identification of the correct tRNA. And once we had the critical crystal structures, this one being Venki Ramakrishna's picture of the 30S and the 50S together, he was showing that this is the place of the decoding, and here's the decoding region, and he was showing the anticodon stem loop of the tRNA, with the anticodon here, and the messenger RNA here, and he showed what was happening here, but you can see a little better on this picture up here. This is looking right into the decoding region of the 30S subunit, and these are the key actors of this. There are 2 bases on this long helix. Remember the 4th helix, or the 4th domain of the 16S RNA contains the decoding region. 1492 and 1493 are bases that are sort of packed into Helix 24's minor group. They're sitting right here, and when the correct tRNA or any tRNA comes in, they flip out. And so here we have a messenger RNA and an anticodon stem loop, and there's a base pairing here between the 3 bases. And the side that we're looking at right here is a minor groove of the helix formed, the small helix between the mRNA and the anticodon stem loop. And those 2 bases look in, and it's not a matter of checking to see how strong the base pairing is between the codon and the anticodon. It's a matter of geometry. And if those 2 A residues fit, then they will take that tRNA. And if they fit, then they will send a signal. As you see, protein S12 is right here. We think part of the signal is they send a signal to S12, which has a contact with the tRNA in another place, which goes in and sends a signal to TU, which then hydrolyzes the GTP on the TU, and then so we'll go over that again, but the point is, it's a matter of these 2 bases. Every time a tRNA comes in, they go in and they check, and if it's not the correct match, they come back and the tRNA floats off. If it is correct, then they go with the next steps to incorporate that tRNA into the growing peptide. Okay, there's an interesting story here too, because this minor groove is also a place where an antibiotic can bind very nicely. It's called promomycin, and you see it right here. And promomycin tends to go in to sit there, and when it does, it displaces these 2A residues. They come out. So it's like the promomycin has already initiated the acceptance of a tRNA. So here it's already pushed these 2 into this state that facilitates the acceptance of tRNAs that aren't quite right. So it will accept near cognate tRNAs in the presence of promomycin in some cases. And so you look at these 2 structures with and without promomycin, and you see that they really look quite the same. So this was a nice demonstration of how an antibiotic can affect function, and we can understand it because we can actually see what the structural effect of the antibiotic was here. And this just shows you that you couldn't see on the other figures, but this is looking at the interactions of the first base of the messenger RNA interacting with the 13